This is Truth Part 2. If you've missed Part 1, please go back and listen. We ended with a question: is it possible to know truth? A corollary question is, could there be absolute truth? There are, of course, many definitions of truth, including several theories as well. Some truth matters more in life's adventures, and perhaps how it matters is a good indicator of its truthfulness. To those who believe anything or everything could be true, the declaration of objective, fixed, and universal truth feels like coercion. I shouldn't be forced to believe something is true that I don't like, but that does not change reality. Resenting the law of gravity won't keep a person from falling if he steps off a cliff. The same is true for eternal law and justice. Freedom comes not from resisting it, but from applying it. That is fundamental to God's own power. If it were not for the reality of fixed and immutable truths, the gift of agency would be meaningless, since we would never be able to foresee and intend the consequences of our actions, explained D. Todd Christofferson, a former university graduate of Duke, as a lawyer and then principal law clerk during the Watergate scandals, well qualified in the laws of logic. He currently serves as one of the 12 apostles of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. His article went on to compare life under the two competing paradigms: 1, truth is absolute, or 2, truth is relative. He used David Brooks' article in the New York Times, dated March 16, 2016. Paradoxically, those who claim truth is relative and moral standards are a matter of personal preference are often the same ones who most harshly criticize people who don't accept the current norm of correct thinking. He referred to this as the shame culture.
Under absolute truth, a guilt culture, you know you are good or bad from your conscience, which could be harsh, but you could at least hate the sin and still love the sinner. Under relative truth, you know whether you are good or bad from what the community says, whether that honors you or excludes you. If truth is absolute, there is the rock of our Redeemer, a stable and permanent foundation of justice and virtue. Whereas under relative truth, moral life is not built on the scale of good and evil, it is built on the scale of inclusion and exclusion. Everyone is perpetually insecure. There are no permanent rules, only the changing judgment of the crowd. It is a culture of hypersensitivity, overreaction, and frequent moral panics that everyone feels compelled to accept claims to value inclusion and tolerance. But she can be strangely ruthless to those who stand out from being held hostage to unpredictable rules and the anger of the social media plebs. How much better to have the immutable law of God, that we can act to choose our destiny, to know the truth. On the other hand, under relative truth, one is floating and carried away with all winds of doctrine, to pretend there is no right or wrong. Whereas absolute truth demands that we can repent and live up to gospel standards. On the other hand, we could languish in sin and regret. These two cultures, under absolute truth, a culture of guilt. Under relative truth, it becomes a culture of shame. I have come to see guilt as a product of our conscience or the impressions of the Holy Spirit, and is therefore private and internal, carrying with it a desire to improve and do better. While I see shame as flowing from external sources, originating in one's perception of what is approved by others. The focus is on self, but only as one perceives themselves being judged by others. Shame conflates what one has done with what one is. One tends to impart the error to one's own identity, producing a sense of inadequacy and humiliation, thereby halting progress or improvement. Some have labeled it as satanic counterfeit. Well, one is left to ask, so which is true, and how can I know?
Do I have to be victimized by my own poor choices, or can my conscience prevent the painful consequences? It is simple to see that a culture under the absolute truth column would be practically preferable. But what if one doesn't believe in God and some divine standard? Many atheists claim that given credible evidence, they would believe in God. But which comes first, belief in a thing or understanding of that thing? One ancient historian prophet noted that because the people didn't believe the king's teachings, they could not understand them. Here it seems that belief is a choice and not a product of research and study, as was noted in Part 1. But wouldn't that give place for deception? Yes, but we will explore that more in Part 3. Initial belief is a choice, even if continued belief is conditional. Belief in absolute truth could lead to acquisition of sufficient data to choose disbelief, or it could lead to faith in God. But what is faith? Many see it as a lack of critical thinking or an acceptance of magic or superstition. If it is a tool of a lazy mind, then only the simple-minded would rely on faith because they don't know how to research and acquire knowledge. But what if faith were a pathway to discovery that used hope and the experimental process to understand evidence, how great scientists proceed? It would be, therefore, the beginning of knowledge, and could be the beginning of a trust in a someone, God, rather than a trust in an expectation for desired results, which could be a dangerous predecessor to self-deception. There is much greater protocol detail on this in Part 3. One might say, but I lost my faith in God to doubt, originating from contradictions and negative experiences. There is that thing about expectation again, as mentioned in Part 1. Is there a difference between doubt and questioning? Even God said that we can ask questions. Quote, "Even so shall you receive a knowledge of whatsoever things you shall ask in faith, with an honest heart, believing that you shall receive a knowledge." In fact, he said shortly thereafter that we must ask questions. Quote, "But behold, I say unto you that you must study it out in your mind, then you must ask me if it be right." He began with shall ask, and now is at must ask. Then later he made it a commandment to ask questions in all things. It seems that he doesn't want us to be satisfied with lazy minds. In this progression, it is important to note that God differentiates between asking and doubting by commanding us not to doubt, and then how to prevent it. He says, quote, "Look unto me in every thought, doubt not, fear not." We can conclude what is verifiable by consistency throughout the Scripture, that doubt is forbidden. Because even though doubting and questioning can both be a beginning of discovery, to question begins with Christ, with trust in Him and His process of discovery called faith. To doubt is to begin without Christ and go it alone. We saw in Part 1 that attempted knowledge of truth without a source that knows the future of a thing leaves us only with a prediction, or at best, a theory.
Many years ago, a friend was leading a group of young men into the mountains. Just before leaving, he was approached by another member who said he was going to be taking another individual into the camp out with them. The other individual was an atheist neighbor who, it seems, had asked a lot of questions, and the member didn't know how to answer them.
So he suggested that they go on the camp out in order to talk and ask questions. Well, my friend said he wondered all the way up the mountain when he was going to be attacked with some questions from an atheist. He couldn't imagine what they would be. As they got camp set up and he went down to filter his water, he said he rounded the boulder, and there in front of him, the young man by the name, we'll say Tom, the atheist, who was just finishing filtering his water. As their eyes locked, my friend said he knew in an instant that he was going to have to say something, but his mind was blank. And as he opened his mouth, he heard him say, "Oh, so you're the atheist." And then, of course, had second thoughts about the appropriateness of his label. Tom didn't miss a beat and looked back and said, "Well, yes, I guess that's what I am. That's where the evidence seems to point me. If you were to give me evidence that there is a God, I would be glad to receive it and consider it." My friend said, what do I do to give him something that would convince him that there's a God? He then heard himself say, "Would you just close your eyes and hold out your hand?" Tom happily complied and closed his eyes, held out his hand, and my friend reached into his pocket and put an ink pen into his hand, and then said, "Now, tell me the color." Tom pondered for a moment and then responded, "But I can't see the color." My friend responded with, "Well, you have 5 senses. Use one of the other 4. Tom started to laugh a little and said, "But they don't see color. I need my eyes for that." My friend said, "Well, try harder. Go ahead and feel for color." My friend then waited, and Tom chuckled a moment and then said, "No, you don't understand. Fingers don't tell color." My friend said, "Oh, you mean each sense is data specific?" Tom thought for a moment and said, "I hadn't seen it in those terms, but yes, that is exactly right. Each sense is data specific." Then my friend said, "Tom, I can prove that God is here, that he exists, and that he loves you, and he knows you. But the sense that you would need in order to perceive that is not one of the 5 that you've come to trust. You will first need to learn to identify this other sense, and then learn to trust it through experience." Tom was willing and said, "What do I do?" My friend reached into his pocket and pulled out his small Book of Mormon and handed it to Tom and said, "I want you to read," and then he gave him a reading assignment in the Book of Alma. As you read, pay attention to the story and the things you're reading, but pay special attention to what you're feeling as you read. It is those feelings that are closest to what we can call the Spirit. It's more than feeling. You'll be able to tell that it's different than whatever else you've experienced. And then you'll need to come to trust it. And it is through those feelings that God will make himself known to you as you talk to him. My friend said he watched Tom through the rest of the campout week. Tom would stand there with his fishing pole in one hand and his book in the other hand, reading. And yes, he never did catch a fish. But he was able at the end of that week to identify those feelings and was convinced that there was a God.
So, what is faith, and why is it so vital in knowing truth? According to the writer of the book of Hebrews in chapter 11, quote, "Now faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen." Adding, in the lectures on faith, Another element, faith is a principle of action. Hope and assurance are two aspects of a focus on future outcomes. Evidence comes from the past. One can only act in the present. This definition of faith is especially applicable when juxtaposed with the definition of truth with which we started. In part one, we saw that both past and present are difficult to filter through the personal bias of those reporting their experience. The future can only be theorized, but not known, unless one has access to and trust in someone who knows the future. That is where faith, which also addresses the past, present, and future, can be so useful, if one can gain sufficient skill and confidence in using the process of faith in a way that obviates deception both from self and others. We will address this competency in part 3, but first let us establish a foundation. We will continue to use Holy Writ as our source, since some claim that faith is simply a substitute for a lack of knowledge, but note both what it is not and what faith uses. Quote, "Faith is not to have a perfect knowledge of things. Therefore, if ye have faith, ye hope for things which are not seen, which are true." So faith is not knowledge, and faith is not hope, but it uses hope. One can have faith in electricity, but the faith that accesses all aspects of truth is rather a faith in the source of truth, that is, God. So, faith is in a person, not an outcome, even though hope addresses future outcomes. Since faith in God includes faith in His timing and wisdom, the hoped-for outcomes submit to God's greater wisdom and power. We will later read how to go about having faith which results in beneficial outcomes, but also in a relationship with God as the source of both the faith and its outcomes. We will see that faith can be used to know if a thing is true, but its power lies in a relationship between true things and hoped-for outcomes, and one's relationship with God. But its power lies in a relationship between true things, hoped-for outcomes, and one's relationship with God. Before contextualizing this definition into the parlance of modern epistemology, we should define the word epistemology and some other related terms as they apply to all of us. The first is metaphysics, defined as a view of reality, including who you are and how you originated. Secondly, epistemology, defined as how you believe knowledge is acquired that you can trust. In the world of philosophy, one's epistemology could be divided into 3 different types. One gains confidence in either rationalism, knowledge from reason and logic, or empiricism, knowledge from observation through the scientific method, including hypothesis, theory, and law. Or third, authoritarianism, which is a large umbrella and includes many different types. This could be defined as the acquisition of knowledge from outside of oneself. It is necessarily resident in an authority. This authority could include God, but if it includes researchers, teachers, clergy, and so on, one is left to wonder how they became qualified to know past, present, and future. The last term is axiology. This is defined as the resultant values, that is to say, what is important to you. So let's examine the relationship of epistemological options. We will use overlapping circles or Venn diagrams. Rationalism, including data, and its assimilation from reason or logic acquired by study, includes such things as psychology, sociology, philosophy, and theology. Empiricism includes knowledge acquired through observation and experimentation, including some branches of science such as anthropology, astronomy, agronomy, chemistry, physics, but could also include theological elements such as the commandments, which can be observed, and their results measured. It is noteworthy that some things rely on a combination of more than one epistemology. For example, rationalism and empiricism are used by science in general, as well as historians, tradition, medicine. Authoritarianism includes that which is known from authority. One gains experience in purported truth by hearing the words or reading the texts. But then one must ask, who is the authority figure? And how did they come to know past, present, and future? And why should I have confidence in them? Therefore, prayer could fit in this sense of acquisition as well. Confidence in the source could be a definition for faith. Faith is usually used to apply to God, but could also be applied to a relationship towards a scientist or a process, as it is with the scientific process. Again, the overlap of rationalism and authoritarianism could include Protestant religions that rely on the Bible for their authority and reasoning process required to understand it. While empiricism and authoritarianism include perhaps those religions that claim direct delegated authority from God, including His commandments, it is important then in this realm of religion to note that there is another option that uses all three epistemologies. That is to say, truth should be weighed and measured rationally, empirically, as well as through the process that we call faith. In a statement by education and religious leader Gerald N. Lund, these three terms are integrated. Quote, whether he recognizes it or not, every person holds to a metaphysical position, trusts in at least one system of epistemology, and holds a personal axiology or set of values and ethics. Furthermore, these three areas of our own philosophy are interrelated. Our metaphysics, our view of reality, influences our epistemology, the way we gain trusted knowledge, and together the two determine our axiology, or our values. So the primary driver for my choices is my metaphysics, or who I believe I am, how I originated. For example, if I believe I am a creation of the happenstance of evolutionary changes over eons of time and survivalist behavior, my choices would be different from believing that I am a creation of God, which would also be different from believing I am more than God's creation, such as I am God's child, with accountability or responsibility to God. So how do I arrive at my metaphysics? Is the subject of part one, as well as my preferred epistemology. I might ask, quote, is it logical? Recognizing that logic isn't necessarily truth, even though truth should be logical. We may also rely on observation and experimentation, but need to also accept that conclusions are subject to bias and future observations. If we look to authorities, even God, then we must also accept the bias factor and the need for continuing connection to the accepted authority. The ultimate result is our set of things we care about, in things like our appetites, relationships, positions, ownership, duty, and so on, defining thereby our axiology. As a process of discovery, faith is used in all three epistemologies. It is not a blind substitute for the absence of knowledge. Faith requires evidence from past experience, observable, measurable results of our actions, and trust enough to initially and experimentally believe. In part 3, we will examine the detailed experimental protocol with which one can grow faith or trust through 3 levels, beginning with investigator and ending with potential certainty.